You are having a perfectly fine day. Nothing is wrong. Life is moving along the way it normally does. And then you open your phone, or you run into someone you haven't seen in a while, or you hear some news, and suddenly your perfectly fine day doesn't feel perfectly fine anymore. It just feels behind. Someone your age just bought a house, got a promotion, launched something, achieved something, became something. And you are sitting exactly where you were 5 minutes ago, but now the sitting feels different, smaller somehow. Or you are genuinely proud of something you did. You worked hard. You got there. It feels good. And then you see what someone else did. And the pride quietly deflates before you even finish reading about it. Not because your achievement changed, but because the measuring started. And once it starts, it does not easily stop. If that experience lives somewhere familiar in your chest, this video is going to explain something important. Today we are talking about the psychology of people who cannot stop comparing themselves to others, and why this is not a personal flaw or a confidence problem, no matter how much it feels like one. Let's start with something that most people find genuinely surprising when they first hear it. Comparing yourself to others is not something you do wrong. It is something your brain does automatically. It was built into human psychology long before social media, long before achievement culture, long before any of this. In 1954, psychologist Leon Festinger developed what he called social comparison theory. His research showed that humans have a fundamental drive to evaluate themselves by comparing to others around them, not because they are insecure, but because in the absence of objective standards, other people become the measuring stick. Am I doing okay? Am I falling behind? Am I safe within this group? Comparison answered all of those questions. For thousands of years, this instinct was useful. It helped humans calibrate their place within their community. It motivated growth, flagged genuine danger, kept people aligned with the social structures that kept them alive. The problem is that instinct was designed for a community of maybe 150 people at most, not for a phone that delivers the highlight reels of 8 billion people directly into your hand every single day. The comparing brain did not get an update when the world it was comparing against became infinitely large, so it does what it was always designed to do. It compares, constantly, against a pool that never ends. And because the pool never ends, the conclusion it reaches is almost always the same devastating one. Someone somewhere is further ahead, more successful, more together, more everything, and that someone is not you. Now let's talk about what is actually happening in the brain during a comparison spiral. When you encounter information about someone else's achievement, the brain immediately runs an evaluation. Where does this place me relative to them? Am I above or below? Ahead or behind? More or less? If the answer is above, the brain releases a small hit of dopamine, a brief and satisfying sense of standing. If the answer is below, the brain activates the same neural pathways associated with social threat and rejection, not metaphorical threat. The same circuitry that lights up when physical safety is actually at risk. Because to the ancient brain, falling behind in the group was genuinely dangerous. It could mean exclusion, survival risk. That ancient alarm is firing every time you see someone's engagement announcement or promotion post or new house. Your logical mind knows it is just a photo. Your nervous system is responding like something is genuinely at stake, which is why comparison feels so disproportionately heavy sometimes. The reaction is older than the situation causing it. Let's talk about the two directions comparison moves in, because they do different kinds of damage. Upward comparison is when you measure yourself against someone who has more, achieved more, or appears further ahead. This is the most common kind, and it almost always produces the same result, a quiet but persistent sense of lack. I am not as successful, not as attractive, not as far along, not as good at this as they clearly are. Downward comparison is when you measure yourself against someone who appears to be doing worse than you. This one temporarily feels better. It produces a brief and guilty relief. At least I am not in that position. But research shows downward comparison carries its own cost. It builds a self-worth that depends on others struggling, which is an unstable and deeply uncomfortable foundation for a sense of self to stand on over time. Now let's talk about why some people get trapped in comparison loops more severely than others around them. Because not everyone who sees a success post spirals. Some people scroll past it and genuinely feel nothing heavy. The difference almost always traces back to the same thing: the stability of the foundation beneath their self-worth. People with a secure and internally anchored sense of value can observe someone else's success without it threatening theirs, because their worth is not located in being ahead of anyone. It simply exists, independent of the measuring. But for people whose self-worth was built conditionally, on performance and achievement and external validation, comparison is destabilizing, because their worth is always located somewhere relative, always measured against something or someone outside themselves. And a relative measure can always be threatened by the next person who achieves something you have not yet. Let's talk about what social media specifically does to this already deeply wired tendency in the brain. Before social media, your comparison pool was limited to the people physically around you in your actual life. Your neighbors, your colleagues, the people at school. A manageable and somewhat realistic sample of human experience. Social media replaced that sample with an algorithmically curated stream of peak moments from millions of lives. Nobody posts their ordinary Tuesday, their unwashed dishes, their stalled career, their quiet, persistent uncertainty. They post the proposal, the promotion, the vacation, the before and after, the milestone, the announcement, and the brain, which cannot distinguish between a curated highlight and a complete picture, compares against the highlight. It measures your entire unfiltered life against everyone else's most carefully selected and presented moments. And then it concludes, something is wrong with you, when what is actually wrong is the comparison itself. Research from the University of Michigan found that time spent on social media directly predicted decreases in well-being, not because the content was negative, but because passive consumption triggered upward social comparison consistently. The more people scrolled, the more they compared. The more they compared, the worse they felt about their own lives. Now let's talk about something: comparison. Does that goes beyond just making people feel temporarily bad? Chronic comparison quietly but decisively redirects your life away from what you actually want toward what looks impressive. People choose careers because of how they will sound to others, rather than how they will feel to live. They buy things they cannot afford because someone they are comparing themselves to has those things already. They abandon goals that were genuinely meaningful to them because someone else achieved a similar goal faster. They stop measuring progress against where they were and only measure it against where everyone else currently is. And slowly the life they are building stops being theirs. It becomes a response to everyone else's life instead, which produces a particular kind of emptiness. Achieving things and still feeling like it is never quite enough. Because the measuring stick keeps moving, there is always someone further along. The finish line never arrives. Here is what psychology shows about the people who genuinely break free from chronic comparison over time. They do not stop noticing what others have. The brain never fully stops doing what it was built to do. But they change what the comparison triggers. It stops being a verdict on their worth and becomes information instead. That person figured something out that I find interesting. What can I learn from that? What does that show is possible? The shift is from measuring to observing, from threatening to informing, from diminishing to occasionally inspiring. And that shift begins with one question, asked honestly every time the comparing starts. Compared to what version of my own life do I actually want to be living? Not theirs, mine. Because the only comparison that has ever produced a life worth living is the one between who you are today and who you were yesterday. Nobody else's timeline was ever yours to measure against. Subscribe if this finally said what you needed to hear.